You're listening to the Mark Bradford Alchemy for Life podcast.
Do you have time to read? Well, then you're screwed. Stephen King. Well, hey there. Hello to people writing, people reading, and people doing everything in between. There's a quote by Stephen King, and it says, "If you don't have the time to read, you don't have the time or the tools to write." Does that ring true with you? It doesn't with me. And I think it reveals a whole separate misunderstanding that people have. Now, specific to me is the writing, because I spend so much time doing it. I invest so much time, energy, and resources into writing. I've spent a few podcasts talking about creating books, being an author, the writing process. I even have 3 talks on being an author and writing, the creative process, what it means to write fiction, the 3 elements of it, how to write nonfiction and get your ideas across, and so forth. So I'm no stranger to this. But this just doesn't sit right with me, and let me tell you why. Because I believe that reading and writing are 2 separate skill sets. I follow and connect with a lot of people online, at least, that are authors and readers. There are a lot of readers online, and a lot of people who read who don't write. And a lot of people who write but seldom talk about their reading. And again, I think these are 2 separate skill sets. I'm not saying that you can be a fantastic author if you've never picked up a book before, if you've never read anything. Obviously, you've read a lot of things before you've ever even tried to compose something. We spend a lot of our formative years reading and writing in pretty much equal portions. But that's not what this is. You see, if you spend your time reading a bunch of not so great novels and then you just decide, I'm going to write, that didn't help you. In fact, it probably hurt you. And by that logic, if you don't have time to sit, you don't have the time or the tools to be a carpenter. Because, chair, table, that sort of thing. Well, it doesn't make any sense, right? But I mean, the same thing is true for any creative art out there. If you decide that you want to paint, sure, you can visit gallery upon gallery upon gallery. If you spend your entire day looking at other people's work, something is supposed to eventually happen. The thing that eventually happens is inspiration. And the inspiration makes you want to create. Create for yourself. Create unabashedly, without fear. Right? But this doesn't come from mundanely looking at artwork again and again and again. Now, granted, you can study styles and periods and history and meaning and development and suffering and the art and all that stuff. You can study all that stuff. And sure, you should be a lifelong learner. That's wonderful. But if you decide that you love Monet, you love it, can't get enough of it, and you keep looking at it, and you do finally get yourself some paint and an easel, and you start to paint because you think Monet is the best, what do you think you're going to do? I mean, for the most part, you're going to try to paint like Monet, and now you're a copy of Monet. Oh, well, we should just look at other artwork. Okay, well then how do you decide which one you like? Well, you'll tell me, well, of course, you get to the point where you're like, well, I like a little bit from A, B, C, and D, and maybe I combine that together, or maybe I don't like any of them, and that's where my style comes from. Exactly. Your style didn't come from them. It came from a combination or an emptiness. And more often than not, people who are creative, who produce something that people really stand up and take notice of, are people filling the void. They create something that no one else does. And you can't get that by constantly looking at what doesn't exist. So stop reading. Stop going to art galleries and make your stuff. As I've said before, life is made of 3 things: time, energy, and resources. So you may have all the time in the world to read and write, but you may not have the energy for it, Mr. King. Because you can go to work, have 6 hours to come back home and say, I'm going to work on my novel tonight. But then you go through your day and you're drained and your soul leaks out and you come back home and you have to deal with your kids or your spouse or both. And this time you have is meaningless because all you want to do is stare at the TV and watch a show that's meaningless, that has nothing to do with what you want to do at that point, because you don't have the energy. And that's what I talk about time and time again in Alchemy for Life, is that you have to watch what your energy is doing. You have to watch where you're getting it from. You have to decide what charges you and what drains you. And if you don't know what that is, then you're not going to have the energy to pursue this thing that you want to pursue. And let me just come back full circle and spend more time talking about this specific quote and example. I think reading is a very special skill enjoyed passively in large quantities by people. People love to get a good book, a book that fits the kind of genre and experience that they want. And they sit down and they read it, and they read more and they read more and they fall asleep reading it. Or they eat and they read it, and they eat more and they read it, and they say, this is the thing I want to do. I love stories like this. And then they figure out what this is, and then they want to read more stories like this, and so forth. That kind of reading typically doesn't motivate them to shove all those books aside and say, I'm going to make one of these too. Cool. It's the feeling of saying, I keep looking for new books and none of them really make me feel that way I want to feel, or they're this genre, but this genre, why does everyone who writes this genre suck at it? Or why does everyone who writes this genre write it this way? Why do they write it so seriously? Why don't they have a little fun with it? Or why isn't this genre ever treated with dead seriousness? Wouldn't that be cool if they did that? Or what if they mixed this genre with this one, and so on, so on, and so forth? That's the void that shows up that they want to fill, and then they start writing. And guess what happens when they commit to writing? They don't really read a whole heck of a lot, because they're busy writing. They're busy researching and writing and enjoying it and reading it back to themselves. And if you've ever written anything, you know, if you write something, you're going to read it about 30 times. And God forbid you decide to recite the audiobook, then you're going to read it more. So I'm saying to you as a takeaway from this, as I always like to give you, don't compare one skill to another, or don't compare time as this like universal slot that you could just shove anything you want into. You know? It's disingenuous to say that if you don't have time for reading, you don't have time for writing. Just like if you say, well, if you don't have time to change tires and be a mechanic, then you don't have time to be a race car driver. Two different skill sets. Some people might have that skill set. Some people might want to maintain their car and say, yeah, I'd love to work on it, and then I jump into it and race it. But you don't really hear that a lot, because they just want to go faster and faster and faster and stay alive. And they work with the people who are really good at keeping them alive, and then they hire really good people to continue to keep them alive. And that's how that works, typically. I'm no race car driver. But I'm telling you, you don't read a lot when you write, and vice versa. So I'm going to get all the points in this one, because I'm going to hit all the bases I sometimes hit. I already told you about time, energy, and resources, and how important energy is. I already told you how time isn't a universal thing. And I'm going to use the other phrase I like to use, which is don't beat yourself up. So if you're trying to pursue a certain skill and you think there's a sort of a rudimentary version of it, a larval stage, if you will, like suggesting that reading is the larval stage of being an excellent writer. Within reason, but not very far. Then don't beat yourself up because you're not doing that one skill that you think is important to build the other skill. Like, especially if the other skill is a result of the skill you're trying to learn. And in other words, a book is a result of somebody writing, which means a book is the reading, and the reading is a result of somebody writing, just like a chair is the result of somebody being a carpenter so that you can sit. Okay. Is there a skill you want to pursue, or are pursuing, or are trying to get better at, and you're being convinced that there's a piece of it that you should be looking at, and it just doesn't feel right because you want to do the other thing? I'm not telling you to skip over a learning experience, but I'm telling you that you have to keep your eyes open. And this quote doesn't help you keep your eyes open. It does quite the opposite. I hope you enjoyed my talk/rant, and I will see you next time. Hey, it's me. Thanks for listening. I appreciate it. Got to tell you that The Sword and the Sunflower has been out, and if you pick up a copy of The Sword and the Sunflower, you'll be ready for the release of Amira, the epic conclusion to the story of The Sword and the Sunflower.